fallout from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Michael Walsh is a partner at Foley and Lardner. Hi, Michael.
How are you?
Good. Thank you very much for sitting with me on this very important topic. What are the major disruptions to supply chains that you have seen so far that have occurred to date as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
That's a great question. And there have been many, but not as many as one might think. So let's start with the biggest issue in supply chain disruption right now, I would say, is the Ukraine grain not being exported to where it needs to be. And that's not necessarily a supply chain issue, but it is a logistics issue. It is difficult. Ukraine is one of the largest exporters of grain, particularly to Africa, and that is where I think one of the biggest fallouts will be. What's interesting about the Russia sanctions and the Russia situation in general is that the United States and companies in the United States that do business or did business in Russia pre-invasion seem to have been able to get out of Russia with, I won't say minimal disruption, because it's, of course, extraordinarily expensive to leave operations behind. But a lot of companies just pulled up stakes and walked away. So what does that mean? Well, Russia still needs goods and services, and Russia still needs goods and services that it does not necessarily have on hand in Russia. And so I think the fallout that we're seeing now is companies asking, what can we send to Russia? What can't we send to Russia? And if we can send something to Russia, do we want to? And I believe the majority of companies have said no. For instance, you've seen articles how the Russian automotive industry is crippled because automotive suppliers are choosing not to send parts into Russia. I think you will see issues play out with European oil as well. But Russia not being a great net exporter of manufacturing goods to the United States, very few, I think, U.S. manufacturing operations outside of the Russian area have been impacted as greatly as they would if a parallel sanctions regime were set up in the event of a conflict with other countries, I would say.
But the big impact then would be on those who have been purchasing Russian grain and Russian raw materials, of which there's quite a bit. And that affects the supply chain. If not supply chains, it affects buyers all over the world, I would think.
Absolutely. And the downstream effects of that, I mean, clearly playing out in Europe right now, there's I don't want to say an energy crisis yet, but Europe is struggling to figure out ways to alternatively source energy. Without energy, the European manufacturing and European economy gets hit. And so that will be, there will be downstream effects. I don't know that they are being acutely felt right now. And I do think that there still is time, particularly in Europe, to continue to try and find alternative sources of energy and hopefully minimize the European the impact on European companies and American companies that buy from them.
Right. Now, when it comes to exports of goods and services, especially from the U.S., which industries have been hit hardest by sanctions so far?
It's interesting. The inbound exports to Russia, I don't know that they were ever all that great to start with. And obviously the impacted companies will feel differently about that because there is an impact. But I mentioned automotive. That is one where there were exports into Russia. And then, with respect to energy, all of the support functions and the infrastructure that would go into building the drills that are allowed to get oil out of Russia. So the U.S. oil concerns U.S. energy. I think there is an impact there as well, an obvious revenue impact on the sanctions. And I believe the financial ramifications of the decisions to pull up and walk out of Russia, those will be litigated long into the future.
And of course, on the finance side, banking and the like, certainly there are very strong sanctions that are in place now.
Certainly, and the
Yeah.
banks, I think, have been able to pick up and walk away, and they, the banks are used to this, and they have ability, and they have the ability to shut things down relatively quickly. And there were a number of Russian entities already sanctioned prior to the invasion. So I think financial institutions in particular sort of knew what to look out for and knew how to implement blocking sanctions when they came down.
Now, for those exporters who have been shipping products to Russia, what is their vulnerability or responsibility for illegal transfers that happen several steps down the line? They might be selling to an accepted party, non-Russian, and then that stuff gets passed on to Russia. To what extent are they being held responsible under this sanctions environment?
So under the sanctions environment, as I understand it, original exporters are responsible for that. I have found that companies are taking the obligation to keep their product out of Russia very seriously through enhanced end user certifications and through enhanced due diligence on the customer side, to ensure that they are dealing, that U.S. companies, U.S. exporters are dealing with counterparties who will not transship. And they do their due diligence in a number of ways. There's personal due diligence. There is reputational due diligence that they can conduct into the actual people that they're dealing with. There are certain geographies, certain industries that are known for transshipment risk, that they can, U.S. exporters can move their business away from those, and we've seen that. We've seen the shifting of the flow of exports out of the U.S. based on that transshipment risk, particularly the closer the product gets to a military end use.
Well, certainly a situation that is not unfamiliar to military shippers and those shippers of sensitive high-tech type products. They've been dealing with these issues for years. So I imagine other industries that maybe were back then considered less sensitive are now having to adopt their measures and their due diligence in order to match that type of environment.
I think you are seeing a lot of that, particularly in the heavy manufacturing world. That's not necessarily military manufacturing, and others, and more so than I had even expected. We're just seeing let's just stop. Let's just reevaluate what we're doing in, say, Eastern Europe or anything close to Russia's borders where there is a transshipment risk. Companies are reevaluating China and India for that reason as well. So I do think that the U.S. export community is taking it seriously. I think you made a great point that they are adopting some of the measures that the military shippers have used, but an environment of very careful due diligence is certainly one that we are seeing.
One of the things that has become painfully obvious from this situation is the degree to which supply chains are at severe risk because of single sourcing situations, especially of raw materials, of neon, of lithium, of wheat, for instance, or whatever. Do you believe that this situation is going to wake up companies and supply chains to the point where we might see some permanent shift in sourcing with more diversification to reduce the risk of this happening in future?
I don't see how it can't at this point, because, looking ahead, we have now seen the playbook for the manifestation of geopolitical risk. There was a geopolitical risk that Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia did, and the U.S. and the world put down heavy sanctions. What's the next biggest geopolitical risk right now that people are thinking about? Is the geopolitical risk of China invading Taiwan. If the same playbook is run, every single thing you just mentioned, that is at severe risk of supply chain disruptions. China has critical minerals. China does a lot of back-end manufacturing for U.S. companies, and all of that becomes at risk in the event that the U.S. runs the same sanctions playbook in terms of geopolitical conflict. And so that's a long way of saying I do believe that companies are waking up to this. The message is out that U.S. companies and European companies should be scenario planning. What are they going to do, and how do they shift their supply chain? I think that brings a tremendous opportunity, not only for reshoring manufacturing in the United States, but nearshoring manufacturing in the Western Hemisphere. Mexico is open for business on this front and has been for a while, and certainly Central and South American countries as well. And so I think this is a real opportunity for companies to sit down at the senior management level, think about their supply chains, think about resiliency, and think about ways of just moving their suppliers a little closer to where they need the actual supplies.
Meanwhile, do you think that companies should be buckling down in expectation of even tighter sanctions against Russia imposed by the United States? There's more room for that?
It seems to be escalating every day, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we just saw the gold sanctions. I think that there's always the opportunity of secondary sanctions, which I know that that the U.S. has been resisting so far, but at some point that is certainly a risk. And so I do think companies would be wise to monitor the situation. I think that companies that know that they're I don't want to say on the edge because they're not doing anything wrong, but companies sort of know if they are going to be next in line on sanctions. And so I think that they would be, I think that companies are paying close attention to the issue and buckling down.
A huge paradigm shift in supply chains going forward. Mike Walsh of Foley and Lardner, thank you so much for helping to shine a light on the situation with Russia, Ukraine, and what it might mean for supply chains in the future as well. Thanks very much for being with me.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.